You had a house key on a string around your neck before you were 10. You made your own dinner. You figured out the world without anyone explaining it to you. That created a personality the least recognized and most overseen. That key unlocks something they still don't understand. If you spent your childhood in the 1970s and not reading about it, but actually living through it as a kid, then what you're about to hear is going to land differently than anything you've come across before. You've been filed under nostalgia your whole life. But this isn't about bell bottoms or vinyl records. This is about the invisible architecture inside your mind that the 70s built without asking permission. And if you've ever felt like you operate on a frequency most people can't quite tune into, welcome. You're about to understand why. Here's what the world usually says about kids who grew up in the 70s. They were unsupervised, left to fend for themselves, raised by parents who were too distracted or too broken to pay attention. The polite word is latchkey. The less polite version is neglect. But here's what that reading misses entirely. What looked like absence was actually the most effective training ground for a specific kind of psychological strength that researchers now spend careers trying to understand. Psychologists call it ambiguity tolerance. Basically, the ability to function well when you don't have all the answers and the situation could go either way. Most people find uncertainty deeply uncomfortable. You've been swimming in it since you were 8 years old, navigating a world where the rules change block by block and no adult was there to explain them. And there's a specific reason why this generation handles emotional complexity in a way that baffles everyone else, including themselves. We'll get there. But first, we need to talk about the thing that actually shaped you more than anything else. And almost nobody frames it honestly. Between 1960 and 1980, divorce rates in America doubled. By the mid-70s, they hit their peak. For millions of children, that wasn't a line in a sociology textbook. It was just what happened to their family on a random Tuesday. Researcher E. Mavis Hetherington spent over 20 years tracking more than 400 families through and after divorce. What she documented was a pattern so consistent it earned its own name: parentification. That's when kids start carrying emotional weight that belongs to the adults around them, reading moods, managing tension, becoming the steady one in the room, because the grown-ups were stretched past their limit. Here's something that might challenge you. You probably think of your self-sufficiency as just who you are, your personality. But Hetherington's work suggests something more complicated, that independence, in many cases, started as a survival response. You became capable because the alternative was falling apart in a house that couldn't hold one more person falling apart. That's not an insult. It's actually a more interesting story than "I'm just independent." And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that same coping mechanism unlocked something nobody expected. Let's start with the freedom, because this part rarely gets the credit it deserves. Picture this. It's a July morning, 1976, you're 9. Your mom says be back before dark, and that's the entire parenting plan for the next 10 hours. No phone, no GPS, no itinerary. You leave on your bike, and the neighborhood becomes your jurisdiction. You settle your own disputes, you invent your own rules. You learn through direct experience which people are trustworthy and which ones aren't. And no adult steps in to narrate the lesson. Developmental psychologist Peter Gray has written extensively about what he calls free play, unstructured, child-directed activity with no adult oversight. His research shows it builds exactly the skills that structured environments struggle to teach: negotiation, risk assessment, creative problem solving, and emotional regulation under pressure. 70s, kids didn't get free play as a parenting philosophy. They got it as a default setting. But here's what's fascinating: that freedom didn't exist in a vacuum. It sat right next to something much heavier. The cultural air in the 70s was thick with disillusionment. Vietnam ended badly. A president resigned in disgrace. The economy was brutal. The hopeful energy of the 60s had turned sour, and children absorbed the emotional climate of their era the way they absorb language. Not through lessons, but through immersion. And this next part explains so much about why people who grew up in the 70s and people from younger generations sometimes talk completely past each other. Here's a number that tells the whole story. In 1964, 77% of Americans said they trusted the government to do the right thing. By 1980, the year many of you were finishing childhood, that had collapsed to 25%. You didn't learn skepticism from a book. You breathed it in from the tension at the dinner table, the news droning in the other room, and the weight in conversations you weren't supposed to hear, but absolutely did. And here's the payoff of that specific combination: unsupervised freedom plus cultural disillusionment. It produced a generation with an unusually calibrated internal compass. You don't trust authority by default, you also don't reject it reflexively. You wait, you watch, you assess. That's not cynicism. That's pattern recognition, trained by a childhood spent in a world that kept proving the official story wrong. But that compass has a cost, and it's the part most of you have never let yourselves examine too closely. And let's be honest about something. The relationships you've kept, the friendships from your 20s, the people still in your life after decades, those aren't casual. Psychologist Dan McAdams calls it narrative identity, the way we construct our sense of self through the stories we tell about our lives. His research shows that people who grew up in unstable or emotionally complex environments tend to develop richer, more layered personal narratives. You're not surprised when people contain contradictions. You've been living inside contradiction since childhood, and that gives your closest relationships a specific gravity. When you love someone, there's nothing performative about it. You learned early that not everything stays, so when something does, you hold it like it matters, because it does. But here's the thing: nobody says out loud. That compass, that self reliance, that ability to read any room and adjust accordingly, for some of you, it didn't come from strength. It came from a kid who learned that their needs made other people tired. Some of you became independent not because freedom felt good, but because asking for help felt dangerous. And there's a version of 70s resilience that isn't resilience at all. It's a wall built so carefully it looks like a personality trait. So it matters to ask yourself honestly: do you prefer solitude because it genuinely fills you up, or because vulnerability still feels like a risk you learned not to take? Because one is peace, the other is protection, and they wear the same face. Here's what I want to leave you with. The children of the 70s, the ones who rode bikes home alone in the dark, who sat in the back of a smoky car staring out the window, who watched a culture crack open and still managed to build something real inside the fracture, you developed a capacity that no curriculum teaches and no helicopter parented childhood can replicate. You didn't grow up with emotional safety nets, so you became one for yourself and quietly for everyone around you. You carry a tolerance for reality as it actually is, not as someone promises it should be. That's not damage. That's depth. And the world doesn't always know what to do with depth. It's louder than you are. It moves faster. It performs connection rather than building it. But you know the difference. You've always known the difference. When you're at your most calm, is it because everything is fine? Or because you decided a long time ago that you could handle it when it isn't? If it's the second one, that's not numbness. That's the kid from the 70s who figured out, before most adults could, that the world doesn't owe you stability, and that you can build your own anyway. As you didn't get instructions, you didn't get reassurance, you got reality. And somehow that turned out to be enough.